As we started to discuss in the last panel, moving an agenda through is a great challenge. Presidents often get one thing done, occasionally get two, and in rare instances get three done in their first year or two. And we're delighted to have a terrific panel here to scout out what that looks like, feels like from the ground up. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nikki Hemmer from the Miller Center.
Thanks, Bill. Well, we are going to sort of go in the order of how a bill becomes a law. We're going to start with domestic policy, then legislative affairs, and then communications. So I have here Dan Crippen, who worked with the Reagan team. He was domestic policy advisor and assistant to the president for domestic policy. Dan Meyer, who was in the White House as assistant and deputy assistant to the president for legislative affairs, and Jen Psaki, who is the White House communications director for the Obama administration. And I'd like to start us off by thinking if you could talk a little bit about what some of the challenges and opportunities of the first year are for your particular places within the domestic agenda building, especially for, if you could start us off, Dan, domestic policy.
Sure. I had the luxury, I guess, or good fortune of watching transitions first from the Senate, then from the White House, and then from the Congressional Budget Office. So I got to see several transitions from different vantage points. As my former employer in the Senate used to say, however, many of the things I remember never actually happened. So I want to make sure there's a bit of a caveat in here so that my colleagues here can correct me. Starting with Reagan, of course, which I guess that transition I knew best, there was a consistent message during the campaign, and it was pretty clear what he was about, not necessarily in the specifics, but certainly on many policies. He had a good team around him quickly, as we talked about the White House staffing, pulled from other campaigns. Jim Baker brought people from California that he knew, tapped a congressman who helped a lot for a while, Dave Stockman, and they started the transition quickly and worked very hard. So by February, we had a new Reagan budget, mostly put together by Dave Stockman. In fact, the notebook that came to the Hill was called the Stockman Black Book, for reasons we later understood. So they created very quickly a budget that reflected the Reagan priorities. Ultimately, it was the first time reconciliation was used, passed much of the budget, which had spending cuts, tax cuts, even included things like blocking grants to states. So taking a bunch of these categorical programs and blocking them as they're talking about again. So a lot got accomplished through the legislative budget process. One should probably start by saying, and some of our previous panelists talked a little about, virtually everybody has something happen in their first year. Sometimes it's foreign policy, sometimes, of course, it's been terrorist attacks. In Reagan's case, it was an assassination attempt. And I don't mean to make light of that at all, but it did interrupt some of the progress for a while that was being made. And toward the end of that first year, after these successes were accomplished, the administration sent up in November, maybe late October, a package of Social Security changes, thinking that because they had already had such successes, they could probably or hopefully could replicate that with Social Security, which Reagan thought ought to be reformed. Let's say that didn't succeed very well. A number of provisions were not very well thought out, changing dramatically benefits for early retirement, for example, which many people took as being unfair, unwarranted, and so combined with the other politics of it. But to go back to the beginning just a bit, we despair sometimes of the partisanship. I think it's defined a little differently. We think about it a little differently than in those days. The budget resolution in the Senate, which embodied all of the Reagan policy, there were 39 straight amendments in which Baker had to produce 51 Republicans because no Democrats supported them. In fact, they were all offered by Democrats. And in the House, which was then controlled by the Democrats, as Dan can speak better than I can about, there had to be a coalition formed because the House was controlled by Democrats, of Democrats helping Republicans and helping the president, and it took a fair amount of effort to get there. So bipartisanship was not the rule of the day. not on budget, not on taxes necessarily, certainly not on Social Security. But I think the main lessons here are a couple: the consistent message in the campaign, the ability to translate that campaign message into legislation very quickly, to move relatively quickly, but all of it still takes leadership. In this case, leadership by the president in putting that coalition together in the House to pass the budget. Then I saw the Bush 41 transition from the other end of the avenue at the White House. And of course, the vice president was literally down the hall from all of us, saw everything that had gone on, and was in some cases, some aspects, limited in his abilities to have a big domestic agenda. I mean, he was one of the guys who helped create the Reagan agenda. So it was a little hard for him to go out and say the last guy did it, broke the position so nobody could play it. He had to make kind of modest changes and suggestions. And while he certainly didn't think this, a lot of the voters thought it was another Reagan term. And so he had to be careful about how he positioned himself. There were some things, of course, he had to address, or thought he should address, certainly with the savings loan crisis and other things, so that his initial domestic policy was somewhat limited. And in the transition, there was not as much policy exchange as there were lots of other transitions. And looking from the Congressional Budget Office at the Bush 43 transition, or looking even at the Clinton transition, you see the same kind of elements of the Reagan process. Fairly consistent campaign themes, translated into legislation relatively quickly, taking an opportunity of that first window. As Josh said, there's more than one window. But again, having events intervene. In the Clinton administration, some of that was self-imposed or self-inflicted, such as the failure of the health care plan, but at the same time, got his budget passed, had a fairly large stimulus package, didn't all of it succeed, but some of it did. So again, it was the combination, I think, of those things that moved Clinton along as well in that first year. And then with the first Bush administration, lots of the campaign rhetoric wasn't very defined, but the policy that Josh and others were putting together was quite defined. And so their ability to move quickly was also a prospect that they developed themselves along the way of the campaign. Again, we talked about some of the things that Bush 43 accomplished pretty quickly, worked substantially on No Child Left Behind, on the tax cuts, other significant changes that occurred in the first year. And obviously the first year there was impeded by 9/11 for a long time, although some significant domestic policy happened after that. Again, looking at just a moment back at President Clinton, not only did the health care policy not get through, but it did slow them down and impeded other things. Like Reagan and Social Security, trying to bite off a little too much initially is sometimes a problem. And Congress can only absorb so much. Your resources are only so thick, and you only have so many Dan Myers working for you, so you have limited scope sometimes.
So Dan, once this policy agenda is being developed, what's it look like over in legislative affairs?
Thanks, Nikki. I think the first point I would make is, and it builds on what Dan was just saying, is it really depends on the circumstances in which you take office, and by that I mean what the Congress looks like. When Reagan won, he had a Democratic House, as Dan said, and a Republican Senate. When President Clinton won, he had Democrats controlling both. When Bush won, he had a Republican House and a 50-50 Senate, if you remember. And when President Obama won, he had a Democratic House and a 60-vote Senate. So much different circumstances for each one, and that would, and I would suggest that that dictates the strategy to some extent as well. I remember when I was in the White House, and after President Obama had won, I was at the end of the Bush administration. President Obama had won, and I got interviewed for some publication asking about, did I have advice for my successor, Phil Shalero, who had been named as President Obama's first head of legislative affairs. And I said, and my comment was, and it's relevant to this, is his job's going to be much different than mine. I mean, in the last 2 years of the Bush administration, the Democrats were majority in the Congress, and so you're dealing with a divided government, whereas President Obama was going to have unified government. And my feeling, what I meant by that comment was, Phil's first responsibility was getting an agenda passed. He had to spend his time focused on being united with the Democratic leadership in Congress. And people, after the fact, were second-guessing and saying, well, they ignored the Republicans or didn't try hard enough with the Republicans or whatever. And the point simply is you don't get those opportunities very often, particularly when you had 60 votes in the Senate. And if he hadn't gone for it, he would have been forever criticized for it. So I found no fault in how in that, and I guess that's my an illustration of how they have to look at it. Once you've decided those first-year priorities based on what you ran on, whether it was any of the previous folks or if it's President-elect Trump on, he wants to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act or tax reform or border security, whatever it is, because I agree with what Bill said in the introduction. You can only do a handful of things, but people forget that in addition to those things you want to do, there's certain things that you have to do. You don't have any choice. You don't have any, for instance, they're faced with a continuing resolution that's going to expire on April 28th. They've got a debt limit. They're going to have to do that first year. Their obvious nominations are a requirement. There's probably going to be a Supreme Court nomination. So all of a sudden you have these things filling up, and for which the calendar, and for which you need a strategy, and you're going to have to get votes to pass all of those things. And then add to that, okay, how are we going to approach what we want to do on health care and border security and infrastructure and a tax reform package. And so it all of a sudden, as you layer it on, it gets a lot more complicated. And but that has to be considered up front as well, to make sure you get all of this done. And then once you have decided what you're trying to do, then you just have to develop your strategy for each item on your agenda. Are you, who are the key players? Dan cited President Bush. It was a different approach on tax reform where you're using Bush 43 in this, where you're using reconciliation versus what he was doing with No Child Left Behind. The other example you had where he had that obviously wasn't under reconciliation, and with a 50-50 Senate, he had to put together a bipartisan coalition. Senator Kennedy was very important. Congressman George Miller in the House, along with Boehner, and Judd Gregg, I think it was the chairman of I can't remember. It was 50-50 who was chairman of the Help Committee. But that's you have to look at each part of your agenda and figure out, okay, how are we getting this one done? How much can we or will we do under reconciliation, which by nature is a partisan exercise. So you're going to drive, in the Trump case, you're going to drive Democrats away by doing reconciliation. But that'll be deemed a necessity, and I don't fault that strategy either. But then they're going to have to come back behind that and try to put together bipartisan coalitions on items that you can't do under reconciliation, which, as we've all learned, includes part of the replacement of the ACA. So it'll be a complicated first year, as it is for everybody. But that's the way you need to approach it in my mind. And
so I said I wanted to go third because the policy and the legislative roles are really what our jobs are all about, or what communications is all about. I would say one of the things that people forget if they've only done a campaign and haven't worked in government is that campaigns are aspirational, and you're held accountable for basically nothing. And so that was true, and now there's a consistency, and there should be, for what a president talks about when they're running for office and when they come into office. That was true for President Obama. Including for many of the policy areas where his comments were perceived as very controversial, like talking to our enemies. But when you come in as a communications professional, but probably in any role, there is an adjustment where you realize everything we do matters. We're under a very different microscope. We can't just say we're for a certain policy. People are going to ask fair questions like, oh, that sounds good. How are you going to pay for that? And what are you going to give up to pay for that? And that's an adjustment, I think, from a communication standpoint. You really come in, you learn very quickly. I would say some of the things that I'm sure the new administration will deal with that we did as well is the prioritization. And we've talked about that a little bit here, but For us, President Obama talked about a lot on the campaign trail, but when he came in, obviously we were dealing with a financial crisis. We were talking backstage about the overlap in the work that the Bush administration and the Obama administration did together during the transition, which was essential. And if we hadn't worked together, we would have probably ended up in a different place. But the president came in, and that is basically what we had to do first and foremost, is pass what were some pretty unpopular pieces of legislation, but there was agreement that they were necessary, whether it was TARP or the Recovery Act shouldn't have been controversial, but of course we only got 3 Republican votes, so maybe it was, but a lot of spending. And what the president really wanted to do early on was healthcare. And hindsight's always 20/20 in any of these jobs. You go back and you look what we could have done differently. Of course, there's things we would have done differently, but what everybody has said here to date is definitely true in our experience, and I was there in the beginning as well as still now, which is that you prioritize, you're not going to get everything you want to get done. So you really make choices. And for us, there was a big debate internally about how big of a healthcare package. If you did a smaller healthcare package, could we have gotten cap and trade? I don't know, maybe. I mean, you look back and you guess these sorts of things. But that's the early prioritization, impacts the communications too. The last thing I'll just say is, while governing is entirely different from the communications standpoint, there are some things that help a president get elected that you sometimes can lose the thread on, and we did a little bit, which is winning the hearts and minds of the American people. It's very easy to come to Washington and only talk to people here and think that you're going to convince people to come your way. But what we learned through making mistakes, I would say, in the first year, is that you really need to use the power of how the president got elected to win people over and spend time doing that and sell your policies in a way that you get the public on your side. And that seems like there's not enough time to do that when you come in, but certainly a lesson we learned.
One quick addendum. Both of my colleagues referred to it, and it's when you're setting priorities, setting legislative strategy, or even developing policy, you have to keep in mind what kind of presidential resource you have. And what time are you going to spend on these priorities? How many phone calls, how many televised addresses, how many trips to the Hill, all of those things. And so it's not just how far can you push the policy or how many votes can you count. It's really important on keeping in mind that you have a limited resource that goes into those decisions.
Including the president's time, which is the most valuable resource.
Exactly, that's what I was referring to as the president's time.
So sitting up here, you three all seem very collegial, but I suspect that there are some
It's temporary.
some tensions, right, between your various areas, whether it's domestic advisors trying to convince legislative affairs that they need to do something, that your priorities might be a little different, and what you want to do might be different. So how did you navigate those relationships with other departments within the White House?
Shall I start?
We all have our anecdotes on this one.
We do. Do we tell them, though?
I'll let you start, but I'll tee it up with a story. When I went in the White House, my predecessors as Leg Affairs said, one of the roles of Leg Affairs, one of the ways I describe the Office of Leg Affairs is you're the president's eyes and ears on the Hill, but you're also the Hill's eyes and ears back into the administration. So, and what folks who preceded me told me is you'll be surprised at the number of times you're going to be in meetings inside the White House when you have people who think they know what's going on the Hill or understand the Hill say, we have to do X, Y, and Z, and you're sitting there thinking, that'll get 3 votes on the Hill. and you get to kill it because you have to say that. But anyway, with that tee-up, I'll defer to the domestic policy person.
Begin to question your own loyalties. And occasionally wonder if you work for the CIA. There's always a tension, and it's with communications as well. I once had a deal with our communications director that I wouldn't do communications if he didn't do policy. Neither of us held to that completely. I was better than he was. But we certainly have to be cognizant of what the president has said, what those policies, and we were reminded very often about the consistencies of the presidencies and how important it was that we develop policy that reflected that. We developed speeches that reflected that we pushed legislation, obviously, but there is a tension. I mean, the policy folks think anything's passable because it's good stuff. We always assume you can develop a communication strategy from whatever the policy is, again, because it's good stuff, without understanding fully the realities of your professions at all.
So I joke with my staff sometimes on tough days that I'm going to get a T-shirt that says it's a communications problem. Sometimes it's a communications problem, but sometimes it's bad policy, and sometimes we lose a vote in the House or the Senate because people think something's going to pass and it doesn't. So these are some of the roots of the tensions. I think one of the things that as a communications or press person, you have a responsibility to do in any White House is to recognize that it's not all about what your objective is. If our objective was solely on how things would sell with the American public, we'd probably do different policies and we'd probably push different legislation. And sometimes, oftentimes, that is far more important. So in the early days, the auto bailout, which now we talk about as one of our big things we did, which is so great, was so unpopular. It was terrible. Everybody hated it. They thought it was the worst thing that we could have done. And we had a responsibility to sell it because the president and the economic team thought that it was the right step. Now, it turned out to be the right step, but there is, you have a responsibility in any White House to recognize there's long-term objectives. If you have a good leader who's the president, and they have to recognize that sometimes the stories are going to be terrible for a couple of months because it's the right policy. One just last anecdote I'll share is, the other piece that often people don't recognize is there are a lot of limitations to what you can say, either because there are national security reasons why you can't change exactly what you say about certain things, or even on the economic front. When I came in, the political and press teams wanted to say, things are so, to the public, things are so terrible and awful, you don't even understand how bad they are. I mean, something more articulate than that, but that was the basic message. And the economic team would say, that will crash the markets, that will rile the markets. And so when people look back, they say, oh, you have a communications problem, and there are things we could have done better. But there are certain limitations you have when you have the responsibility of the presidency. And that's sometimes hard to explain, I'll say.
Dan, you want to throw in any further anecdotes?
So I've kind of took my shot at the policy side already. I never actually had, there wasn't much tension between the legislative affairs and the communications. One of my observations of Washington over my years here is whenever anybody has a failure, or one side or the other, usually in an election. So, Republicans in 2006-8 or the Democrats in 2010, or I can even remember it back when I was on the Hill in 1998 when Republicans lost a handful of seats when they thought they were going to pick up seats. The messaging always gets blamed, right? It's never what you did. It wasn't because you were pushing impeachment in 1998, or it wasn't because what you did in your first 2 years in 2010. It was the messaging. If only our messaging could be fixed. So I was always pretty sympathetic to the communication side because they always got blamed for it.
You can keep your health care plan was a policy idea. It wasn't a messaging point, so just to say that for everybody's understanding.
Exactly. Anyway, that's about all I have.
Well, if we could turn attention from, and let's.
No, I promise this last time I'll try and have the last word. We all think, and it's not us three necessarily, but certainly our colleagues that we work with, all think they can do our job. I mean, Dan mentioned someone pushing policy that's 3 votes. Everybody has a communication strategy that they're sure will work if only we'd pursue it. If we play the right policy, we'd get the right number of votes, and of course everybody's always doing policy.
Everybody's always doing legislative affairs too, especially that one.
So those are the internal relationships. What about those external relationships that you have to navigate in each of your roles, whether it's the press, whether it is the public, whether it's Congress? What were the challenges or the experiences that you had trying to navigate those relationships as sort of the person in the White House who was reaching out to these other stakeholders?
I think on the legislative front, one of the things you have to get right the first year is how you're going to manage the outreach to the Hill. So you do need, the ideal from my perspective is you need the person who's the head of legislative affairs to be managing that. Now that doesn't mean the legislative affairs shop is the only ones who can talk to the Hill, but if anybody else is talking to the Hill, the legislative affairs team needs to know about it. And so Yeah, every administration has their horror stories. I can remember going. By the time I was in the Bush White House, that had kind of gotten worked out. People were, of course, my boss was Josh Bolton. He would talk to the Hill, but he was really good about, I got a call. Harry Reid's calling me, why don't you come down, and that sort of thing. But I remember telling Shalero, you have a president who was a senator, a vice president who was a senator, a chief of staff who was a member of the Democratic leadership, and you're just going to have a lot of people. And I don't mean to be singling out. Every administration goes through that. So if you're going to have a successful first year, you need to sort that out very quickly on putting a system in place so that if there's any outreach to the Hill that is coordinated under the Legislative Affairs shop.
I think in terms of relationships with the press, I see Ann Compton here, so I'm just like, she's in my eye. I think if there isn't tension, then you're not doing your job, and the press isn't doing their job. And I mean that within reason. I mean, I think the age of civility needs to, I think, return or be a part of how people interact between media and public officials. I, in the early days, was the only woman in the press office and was a spokesperson. And this is not purely a gender thing, but I will say that a lot of my male colleagues were a bit more likely to scream, slam phones, yell, and it wasn't always the most effective thing, to be totally honest. But I think in the White House, the press always wants more access to the president, and we always don't. We never want to give as much access as people want. But there are some traditions, the pool, or which exists, as I think most people in this room know, because there have been enough, unfortunately, assassination attempts on presidents that there's a public right to know. Now, you can argue, do they need to go to the, kids' basketball game or the restaurant? You can argue those points. We've been through, I think, over the last 8 years, a lot of changes in the media. I think in terms of how people consume information and how we reach the public. And what's challenging from somebody in my role, and I'm sure will be challenging for my successors, is that there's so many outlets now and so many ways people consume information that you can't just talk to the White House press room because you won't reach a lot of people. But those people in the press room are also responsible for and attuned to everything the president's saying and people are saying, and they hold you accountable too. So there's a big push and pull, which is challenging. One of the things we went through fits and starts of, sometimes better than others, was making officials in the government available. That's oftentimes what people in the media want access to. They want to talk to the policy experts, right? Sometimes they want to talk to the Legislative Affairs folks, but they don't really want to talk to them. But the policy experts often will, and the truth is that's very useful for any president. And sometimes, to the staffing point, you just run out of resources and time and ability to do that. But that's always something that's useful. But there's always a push and pull with the press and the White House, and an element of that is healthy. But there are certain parts of tradition that certainly should continue.
I was going to say that thank God we didn't have Twitter, but I can't imagine Ronald Reagan using Twitter. So wouldn't have mattered probably.
You wouldn't give him his password, just
No,
like we don't give
not.
any officials their passwords.
But it's, as you said, it's useful for policy folks sometimes to talk to media, and that's why I had the deal I had with our communications folks. And I was always off the record, or whatever the right term is these days. So I tried not to get in the press. That wasn't my role, and I thought press ought to be made by the people we're working for. But there are other outside groups, and I don't know whether you were alluding to them or not, but that certainly in domestic policy in the White House, it's your responsibility in many ways to keep up with the outside groups, to meet with them, to talk to them, to make sure their policy papers do get into a process. Otherwise, you lose not just your base, but a constituency or important advocates. And so part of the White House apparatus, whether it's domestic policy or somewhere else, is kind of the contact point for many outside groups that don't have to necessarily be supportive, but certainly that's the first place you go.
Well, we've spent the last 6 years or so talking about the problems of divided government when it comes to enacting a domestic agenda. Are there any pitfalls to having a united government, or is it just an unadulterated good for your domestic agenda?
Yeah. As Dan could tell you better than I, it's sometimes much worse. That you're expected to produce more when you have, a unified government. But your party colleagues on the Hill also think they have more discretion to not agree or to intervene with policy and try and get you to do things that they want you to do. So it's not uniformly a good thing.
Yeah, there are lots of pitfalls. Just going back to what we were talking about before, I think you come in with a unified government, there's expectations that get raised that are sometimes hard to beat. And I think you're going to see this in this coming year. They intend to do major tax reform under reconciliation or repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act under reconciliation, and you can't do it all under reconciliation. You have limits under reconciliation in the Byrd Rule in the Senate, and so I mean, I saw it even with divided government here in recent years, where Republicans controlled the House and the Senate, and there were some members who didn't understand why they couldn't, get things done, and government was shut down, with those sorts of claims that we could force the president to sign something. It's like, where did you go to, your civics class? I mean, it doesn't work that way, and it still doesn't work that way. And so the challenge is people aren't realistic. They set their expectations so high, and so then you set yourself up to fail if you can't achieve everything, and that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're a two-party system, and both of the parties, and certainly the Democratic Party, is a big umbrella, and I'm sure the Republican Party is too, right? And that's the beauty of it, that everybody doesn't have identical thoughts, but there's an expectation that people will all march to the same drummer, and the fact is everybody has different politics, people have different views, and these all come into play. If you look back at when President Obama came in and we had the House and the Senate and a pretty sizable number, as was already referenced in the Senate, getting healthcare done was really hard. It almost didn't happen. And that was with majorities in both houses. So even with the incoming administration, you need 51 to repeal, you need 60 to replace, right? And that's not easy. That's hard. And so, the systems that are in place for a reason, but I think sometimes you forget how hard it is to get bills passed.
We like to think we have a tent, by the way. You have an umbrella.
Okay, umbrella, tent, sorry.
That's all right.
They're sort of cousins.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get all of your advice to the incoming administration, but actually I want to start with Jen with a specific question, which is, you've been working very closely on creating new policies and strategies for navigating a very changed media environment. So what kind of advice would you give to the incoming team about how to navigate that? What sort of things that you've learned in your time in communications for the White House that might be useful going in?
Sure. I would say that, the way that we view media now is that it's not a social media versus traditional media. There's a big spectrum, and most outlets are on that spectrum. Now, I'm not counting platforms that are social media platforms. That's sort of a different beast for a different panel and lots of questions to be discussed. But so that's how we view it. I would say the lessons we've learned are that, you want to think about your prioritization, which is driven by your policy team, and really force the system, even when everybody doesn't love it internally, to focus on those priorities. 1,000 flowers cannot bloom in government because you'll spend, you're responsible for everything. In terms of the way that you communicate, we've found that a mixture of what people would view, and I really hate the term traditional or mainstream media, but I'm just going to use it because people know what it's a reference to, and social media is probably the sweet spot, because what our objective is to try to communicate with the American public and the American people. And you can't be snobbish about, oh, well, this outlet's only been around for 5 years and then therefore they're not eligible. Because the fact is a lot of those outlets do really interesting and really good, serious work. There's an inaccurate and I think unfair perception that people like to throw out there that we only do Zach Galifianakis, which frankly I've been back for 2 years and that was before I came back. So, the fact is that had an objective to sign people up for the Affordable Care Act. But we do a combination, and there are outlets that are online, like Mike.com is an example, where we did a lot around the Iran deal. We've done a lot around serious policies that do really good work. And sometimes I think there's an us versus them in mainstream and social media or online outlets that is not healthy. The last thing I'll say is that while it's important to recognize the opportunity with all these new outlets, there's also a lot of risk, as we've seen. And I don't mean risk for a president. I think we've learned from even the reporting over the past couple of weeks that the way people digest and consume information, it's hard for people to differentiate what they see online. And so while I think it's important to take advantage of all these options, there should be a discussion, I think, in this country about how to make sure people are getting reputable and accurate information. And that's where a lot of the mainstream outlets come in that are not swayed. Sometimes you argue editorial boards or whatever, but can provide that information to the public. And so I think that shouldn't be lost. That was really a tirade on media. That was really like, there's a lot to be said about this issue. But the advice I would give is just relationships matter. I mean, get to know the reporters who cover you and get to know what they care about and what they're thinking about. And often they have their pulse on the public. Keep focused on your priorities and your issues. Don't be afraid to try new things and recognize that sometimes things fail, but be humble when things are not working and change it when it's not working. And there are people that have been in the press corps a long time, and Ann certainly was one of them when she was still with us at the White House, who we relied on not to ask what we should say on things, but to just get a gut check on is this like is this okay, or what should we be doing more, or should we be doing less? Because they have a better sense of the traditions of the White House that are important than often an incoming staff does. I clearly have a lot of thoughts on that issue, so sorry if I talked too long.
As someone who writes a lot on media, I'm here for the tirade.
Yeah.
Dan, what would your advice be for the incoming team?
I'm not sure I have any advice on the communications side. I'm curious to watch because one of the things I've noticed over the last few years is you've particularly on the Republican side and on the conservative side, you've got a lot of folks who try to influence the process and who's from the right who see their role in life and try to keep everything pure. And I'm curious considering how the president-elect got elected and his use of social media, how that's going to play out. So, for example, he's not going to. The Republican leadership's not going to agree on everything he wants to do. He's as John Boehner said, I'm not sure he was a Republican before he started running. He obviously got nominated as a Republican, got elected as a Republican, but he's much more independent-minded than your normal Republican president. And so at some point there's going to be a tension. And does he take to Twitter? And even for individual members who might, all of a sudden you have some of the groups on the right say, no, this infrastructure package, it's bad in this circumstance, and trying to make it hard for Republicans to vote for it. And all of a sudden now there's going to be this counter pressure from the president saying, they're wrong. And I'll be very curious to see how that all plays out. I think it changes the dynamic significantly, and it'll be just curious to see it play out.
And we'll go to Q&A just after this, but Dan, any advice?
Like Dan, I'm not, don't have much advice for an incoming administration. The one thing that certainly helped in the policy strategies and legislative strategies I've been involved in is that we have to there has to be a consistent message. Mm-hmm. You have to have a message. You have to be saying something that's important, or at least understandable and attractive to whoever you're talking to. And we don't have a message, and I'm afraid I don't know what this president-elect's message might be on various things, but if you don't have a consistent message, it's very hard. experience has been legislatively, but certainly to try and sell your policy, you need to be able to talk about it and consistently talk about it.
All right, well, if there are questions, if you'll just wait for the microphone.
Yeah, I'm Charlie Clark with Government Executive. The Office of Legislative Affairs under Obama got criticism for things like not returning phone calls or not answering correspondence. And some Republicans said they would have been willing to cooperate more had that happened. Is that any of that accurate? And in general, does the Legislative Affairs Office have a duty to return the phone calls?
It's always a good idea. Let me defend the Obama Legislative Affairs just because I know a lot of them, and I've been in small groups. The Miller Center has brought together Legislative Affairs directors from the Bush 41, Bush 43, Clinton, and Obama White House, and the Obama folks will give you chapter and verse, and I mean I think very sincerely about how they reached out, and it does take two to tango, but we've also heard those stories on the other side, not just from Republicans, that they weren't as visible. So it really depends on your approach. I would again make the case that particularly at the beginning of the Obama administration, their focus needed to be on the Democrats. So if the Republicans got a little bit less attention, I don't find fault with that. But in divided government, it's a different situation. Look, if you're gonna try to get your legislative agenda passed, you have to be figuring out how you're putting together 218 votes or 60 votes in some cases. And so there's a lot of people you need to pay attention to, and that's an important aspect of the job.
I'm Basil Scarless. I used to work at the State Department. My question relates to the filibuster. My understanding, and I'm sure you could correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Senate can at the outset change the rules on the filibuster by majority vote. Is that the case? And secondly, would you expect it to happen?
So in theory, you're supposed to have two-thirds vote to change the Senate rules. Senator Reid changed the filibuster rules by ruling and precedent, and for a number of circumstances, nominees, not Supreme Court or some of the judges. But so could it happen? Yes. Are they going to do it up front? No, I don't think so. Senator McConnell is an institutionalist. Now, having said that, this goes back to the part of the conversation we were having before about having unified government and managing expectations. The first bill that gets filibustered, there's going to be people conservatives in the House or conservatives on the outside who are going to say, McConnell, you're blocking it because you won't get rid of the filibuster. And so that's just something he's going to have to deal with. But he's made it pretty clear that at least up front, he doesn't want to do that. He didn't want to do it before when it was done under the Democrats.
Hello, everyone. I'm with the Epoch Times. My question is a bit general. How would you predict the Trump way of presidency, given that before he has come into the office, he already saved over 1,000 jobs for a carrier company, and he has selected so many famous names into his cabinet, and also he had a telephone conversation with the Taiwan president, which is breaking the diplomacy of 37 years. So how would you predict his way of presidency? Thank you.
Those sounds like policy and communications questions.
Exactly. I've had a number of these conversations since the election with lots of people and folks in business and otherwise. I start out the conversations with "who knows," then I speculate for 10 or 15 minutes, and I conclude the conversation with "who knows," and I think that's probably the answer.
I'll just add "who knows."
Well, is there a way in which the things that happen in the transition help foretell what will happen in the first year, or are they just two different beasts? Who knows?
I mean, the nominations made give you an indication of who any president surrounds themselves with and who they want to be providing advice. But even with that, unless somebody has a long legislative history, it can be hard to kind of read tea leaves to predict exactly what advice somebody is giving. So I think it's hard.
I mean, I assume the transition is an indicator because people, I mean, whether it's this president-elect or any previous president, they learn when they get into office and things do change. So at least at the beginning, I presume the transition is a predictor of how he'll operate.
From, I mean, my point of view on policy and experience, I would say that the first budget's also important. I'm a card-carrying member of the Green Eyeshade Society, so I still look at those things. And that you assume that some of the domestic priorities are going to be funded. Those things you don't like are going to be unfunded, but at least it will give you some sense of domestic policy trajectory when they do their first budget.
My question is for Jen. If you could say a little bit more about the discussion that the communications team had with the economics team about what you could and couldn't say, and then if you could kind of reconcile that with Trump's approach and obviously the outcome of the election and also where the market is.
Wow, those are
Which
a lot
isn't
of things.
actually,
I'm not sure
you know,
they're
the entire
related,
economy.
but I'll try. So what I was trying to illustrate is the fact that policy doesn't always make easy communications, and you accept that. I will say in the early days, you know, if people remember, the election and the president's first year or more essentially shifted and changed starting in August, September of 2008, before he was even elected. And there was a recognition that you know, he had a role once he was elected, and even before when it was looking like it was going that way, that he would have a powerful role to play in helping get some policy like TARP across the finish line. And there's the old story of Secretary Paulson. Maybe you were there for this, and you can illustrate this or articulate this better than I can.
I was there.
You know, getting down on his hands and knees and begging him to help pass. So I think for us, we had an economic team reunion on Friday night. Don't be jealous you weren't there. It was a wild and raucous party, but it was great. And one of the things they talked about was how they're terrible communicators. They're brilliant economists and very smart people, but you recognize early on that if we had our druthers, you would have people who were not professionals by trade, but very good at television. But that's not often, nor should it be, how you pick cabinet secretaries, right? So what our experience was, and there were many conversations, not just one like this, where it was always a push and pull between the press and communications team and the economic team about what could be said publicly in terms of articulating to the public how bad things were. But you didn't want to scare people at the same time. You know, one of the biggest mistakes we made early on, and she's said this, so I don't feel bad about saying this, was when Christy Romer made the prediction about the unemployment rate. You know, that was perhaps necessary at the time to, I guess people in the meeting would have argued that was going to get people to vote for the Recovery Act. I don't know that that was true or not, but then it held us to a standard that we couldn't meet, and we could never meet that bar with our on the press side, and that was challenging. As it relates to today, I'm not sure. It's a different, I mean, the economy is in an entirely different place. There are obviously lots of, you know, the economic agenda is always a big part of what any president typically faces or addresses. There's lots of things under that umbrella or tent or whatever you want to say. But I don't know that I can make any predictions about how President-elect Trump or anyone on his team will handle any of these issues, or if that's what you were asking.
In terms of, you're saying that I thought I heard you say that essentially you perceived the economy to be a lot worse than you could say.
I didn't perceive it. It was. Yes, it was worse than we articulated from from the government.
Right.
And there were lots of other people saying it, but there was something about not just something, the president or the Treasury Secretary articulating how bad it was. There was a concern of what impact that would have on the markets, on the economy, and that was a real discussion we had on a very regular basis.
Sure. But I mean, I guess the thing that I look at is typically I hear people talk about how great things are right now, and that is obviously something that Trump did not do, and I would probably argue that that's part of what made him very popular. He said, hey, things are pretty bad for the average person. So I guess I'm wondering if you could jump into your time machine, would you do so and then maybe say something a little differently?
Can I take a quick
Yeah, of
crack at
course.
it? So there's difference between when you're running and when you're governing. So I don't think Jen would disagree. When President Obama was running for presidency, he talked a lot about how bad things were. Candidates do that. Once you get elected, there's an instinct, I guess, that kicks in to try to talk about how it's going to get better. And they didn't say it was going to get better right away. I mean, my recollection is it's not good, but here we're going to put these things in place. It's going to try to get better. But I've been in the same type of meetings that Jen referenced where it's expressed you don't want to talk down the economy because it discourages people, and you're trying to build up confidence. So that's a distinction I would make.
We're actually going to have to stop it there just because we need to clear the stage for another erudite set of panelists. But if you could help me thank all of our great panelists.